All right, well, welcome to today's webcast. We're going to spend some time uh, thinking about something that we normally don't in human services, and that's how we write, how we document. We do a tremendous amount of it, but we don't really spend time thinking about the impact of that writing, where that writing comes from, and the use of that writing. In other words, the audience for that writing. And so this has a great deal to do with customization in employment, and that's why we're here today, hopefully tying some of the pieces around how we get to know a job seeker with some fields of practice that are doing it as well. We are not the only field of practice that focuses on person-centeredness, and that's a good thing. So we're going to spend time talking about meaningful writing, how to capture the strengths of a job seeker, and how that plays out in ideal conditions of employment. So overall, you might want to think about the webcast as kind of a history and impact of documentation. Where does this idea of documenting services and supports come from? How that feeds into what we might call a career profile, a vocational profile, and then looking at stereotypes to avoid. As you might think and guess, there are all types of stereotypes that impact us as we're working with folks. And moving from those labels to how we might capture strengths of a job seeker is really important. And then we're going to spend some time throughout the webinar kind of linking in something called narrative medicine. And before you get too anxious about the phrase narrative medicine, particularly that word medicine, it's important to know that that has always impacted our field and that medicine is taking the lead on using narrative to improve primary healthcare outcomes. Well, I'm Doug Crandell. I work for IHDD, our USED at the University of Georgia, and as well with Griffin-Hammis. I come to this work with a real passion for writing. I often tell people I've combined two mediocre salaries to end up with a life of both writing and working in human services. I write quite a bit around memoir, my own family's history of disability and mental health issues. I build that into novels and fiction. I've written some true crime as well. All of those focusing really on what we do day to day. And so it's interesting to, I think, then take that narrative practice and look at it as it impacts us in our work. So I come to this work first as a sibling, and that's important. And that's important for a framework today. So first and foremost as a sibling. Then as a professional. After 27 years, I have read and written some terrible documentation, and I've read and written myself, I think, some pretty good writing. And then third, I come to that as a writer, and I try to blend these to get to a certain point, to think, at least for a little while, about the power of writing as a method of knowing a specific person. And that kind of knowing part is really important in connecting to ideal conditions of employment. If I don't know a person very well, if I only know them in one or two environments, and I only know them through one or maybe only paid people who are with them, then my way of knowing that person isn't as effective. So understanding personal narrative is important. Not just clinical documentation, not just labels, behavior plans, ISPs, those kinds of things, but knowing someone well so that I can do a better job. And this comes to us. This idea of narration, of narrative in our work, comes to us from a different part of the human service system. And as I said, that's primary health care. This quote is adapted from the narrative medicine framework, something that I've been spending quite a bit of time reading about. Dr. Rita Charon at Columbia University, it's the only program right now with a master's degree in narrative medicine, but there are over 70 medical programs and nursing programs that require classes around narrative. So this idea of practicing human services effectively requires a narrative competence. That is, the ability to acknowledge, absorb, and interpret and act on the stories and plights of others. If it's good enough for cutting edge narrative medicine, it's good enough for us to think about how that impacts us from day to day. So why think about writing and words in general? Well, we all deal with this every day with texts, emails, all types of kind of written communication. And we're spending around, in 2014 with this research, we're spending around 11 hours a week. Some of us have to spend time returning those emails on the weekend, right? It takes up a big hunk of our time. But this idea, this notion that words and people are the primary elements of our work and most human activity should make us pause and think about how we write. Most of us write in one way. We enter a field, sales, social work, manufacturing, the law, university, provider agencies, and we start writing like those folks writing around us, like the texts that we're reading. And there's obviously a place for that. That's what we talk about audience, what we mean by audience. But it becomes problematic when we cannot then break free of that. The notion and the idea of taking time to think about writing and documentation related to our field of supported employment really came after speaking with a VR counselor. There's a section in the Griffin-Hammis discovery staging record where it says you can write about the person, the job seeker's most endearing traits. And as I asked this person who's a VR counselor and also a parent of a young person with disabilities, she was having a hard time and being very honest about that it was difficult for her to shrug off her training as a vocational rehabilitation counselor and write about a person's specific endearing traits. And I found this over and over again, yet most of us get jobs on our most endearing traits. So being able to figure that out, write differently, is important. We're also, as a country, a little sad from the Pew Research Center. We're reading less. We might be reading more on tablets and news that's in news feeds, but in terms of longer narratives, we're reading less. We're embedded in a system, if you don't know this yet, where we like to ameliorate problems. We are trying to address deficits and weaknesses, and when we do that, documentation becomes rote. It becomes an exercise. I have the great fortune of traveling to several states and getting to know people who are doing employment supports, customized employment, supported employment. And often that takes me to someone's home. And many times that's a group home. And I started noticing 4 or 5 years ago how much wonderful staff, direct support professionals in the home who knew the folks very well were simply writing furiously in large binders, acting on the training they'd been given. That kind of documentation is important, but if it's only an exercise in repetition and it's not tied to outcomes, we have problems. When I was in one of those states, a rather absurd example popped up, and that was somebody's ISP who lived in a rural area. And the goal in the ISP, as it was written, was talking about taking a bus, and that the goal would be for the person to ride this bus. Well, I was pretty shocked that there would be a bus in that rural area, really very rural. And the person told me, well, no, there's not really a bus. We just put that in there and we practice at a kind of pretend bus stop. Now, that's an absurd example of how strange some of our goal setting can be, but also how do you write about somebody in an authentic way when we've put them in a situation that's not even real? So where does this come from? Why do we document in a certain way? If you have spent some time thinking about Medicaid and the important role that that plays in many people's lives, and then certainly Medicaid waivers and the advent of those in states moving from state dollars to Medicaid dollars, obviously that's rooted in a medical model. And so this year marks the 100th anniversary of something that impacts us every single day. I'll give you a little time to think what that might be. What could we be celebrating that we're marking as a country the 100th anniversary? Wish there was a prize involved. There isn't. Well, we are celebrating in our country the modern medical chart. And this is an example of someone who's receiving supports in a long-term care facility. And you'll see that it looks very much like a Medicaid waiver note. You could go through this and compare it to probably any number of charts and see the reflection of the modern medical model on the work that we do. It's important to know that because it impacts us every single day. It creates our views, right? Through, again, amelioration. We have to identify something that's problematic and wrong and fix that and have goals and objectives. That's very much like primary care. The non-medical supports though, right? The things that we're interested in, employment, community inclusion, people having real relationships with other citizens in their own communities, those are often delivered then through the use of this medical documentation. And then you can begin to see how that kind of bumps up against each other, right? This idea of person-centeredness, of knowing the job seeker, bumps up against how we have to document. And it does mirror a great deal of what we find in medical charts. So how we train people in our systems is also important to understand. And if you take a moment to think about the training you've gotten around documentation in whatever role you're in, again, you're probably imitating what someone else is doing. You've probably been given some orientation. And most of that orientation is we think that everything needs to be documented. So again, just pausing here to take a look at one state's orientation manual. This is primarily for direct support professionals, employment specialists, other people working with folks who are maybe not in the support coordination role. And you'll see as they go down these general set of rules that there's not a lot of focus on knowing the person. Obviously, we want to make sure from the very beginning that it's not lost or damaged, that someone's privacy is respected, that no one else is mentioned in it. All the originals should be in the file. There should be photocopies and fax copies placed in the file if they're original, if the other one's not available. In other words, we go into black and blue ink, how we should write. These are the items, the documentation general rules that were given people as they enter our systems. And this could be in VR, this could be in Medicaid, it could be in state dollars. Again, more of these rules. These are things that probably all of us kind of assume would be the case, right? Complete dates, including AM, PM, making entries only after the fact, making sure things are legible, signing using someone's full name and title. I think all this sounds very familiar. From the same state, we get a little bit, and I have to provide some kudos to the state, a little bit around creating a narrative. And that is the W questions, right? In your charting, who, what, when, where, how, why. But we imitate what we've read, so many times we don't really start writing about a job seeker, a person receiving services in truly a person-centered way. We're still imitating what we've read before. Here are some more guidelines from a specific state, even when you're doing some narrative writing, right? Making sure all the entries, again, have your name on them, that they're complete, that you're asking for clarification in situations that you may not know the person very well. All these things are kind of related to what we call either progress notes, monthly report notes. In Medicaid, of course, in many states, we're reporting on every 15 minutes. So it's important to understand that we're doing this all the time anyway. And to have that basis of understanding brings us, I think, to some interesting information as well. There's some overlay here with medicine, with primary care, and there's a reason for that if you haven't connected it yet, and that we are really influenced both through Medicaid and other types of medical documentation in what we do. But as you see, for every hour spent with patients, physicians now are spending 2 hours on electronic health records, right? That's pretty amazing. Another study found with nurses that they're spending 1/4 of their 12-hour shift with paperwork. And this is important because we do the same. We've always tried to mirror medicine. Direct support professionals getting more into our area during exit interviews in provider surveys will say one of the reasons that they're leaving is the immense paperwork requirements. They may come to the job very interested in what they're doing, but then leave because they're having to do lots of rote paperwork. That even with all of our technology, right, we're still spending more and more time on documentation rather than less. So you might be saying to yourself, I hope this guy is not saying we can just get rid of documentation. I'm not saying that. We can't sidestep that important function. It is tied to outcomes, which is a good thing. More and more, it's tied to outcomes. And we need some way to prove that we are providing services and supports. But we can always improve what we do in terms of goals and objectives. Those do not have to be rote. The narration within progress notes do not have to be boring and repetitive. The way that we create a career profile mandates us to do that in a way that is person-centered. So we're going to spend some time again just thinking about true narrative and how that can support what we're mostly focused on around employment, whether that's customized employment or supported employment. So here's a fun little exercise, and I think one that can be really helpful. And this is the example I was giving to you about the VR counselor. But to think of a person you're supporting in some way. Maybe they are on your caseload and you're actually the job developer. Maybe you're a support coordinator and you're trying to advocate for the person. But it doesn't matter. Just somebody that you know who's a real person and you're supporting in some way. Change their first name. Don't use a last one. And take a few minutes to do that thing I was talking about a little earlier. Write something about that person that is absurdly in human service speak. Use as many acronyms as you can. Imitate, if you will, the writing that we see all the time in case notes, progress notes, Medicaid waiver, goals and objectives, ISPs, individualized work plans, whatever acronyms you're used to. You're wanting to do this in a way purposefully to kind of exaggerate the absurdity of our system. You take some time to do that, and you read that back, noting the kind of feelings you're having about that writing. What's it sound like? What would it sound like to somebody who's not familiar with our systems? Take some time to then jot down how you're reacting to that writing that you've just done. The second part of this exercise, and this is great to do in staff meetings, in retreats, think of the same person. Think of the exact same person. Now write several sentences focused on that person's most endearing traits. The part that I was talking about earlier in our discovery staging record. That, by the way, when I work with staff, they tend to just kind of gloss over. Not the person's labels, not their unique behavior issues, but their most endearing traits. And we're not using here human service speak. No acronyms. Write about this person, if I dare say, in a heartfelt way. Read that out loud to yourself. How are you reacting to this? Is it difficult? Is it easier for you to write about the good things without our human service language? Try it again. Think of another person, or continue with the same, and write about that person's most endearing traits. Make it narrative. Don't just bullet, but write about a recent experience with that person that again highlighted their endearing traits. I bet you'll feel, certainly like most of us, that we don't get to do that a lot in our daily work. That most of us are having to write in very clinical ways, or in rehabilitative ways, or in those ways that, again, ameliorate deficits and weaknesses. That's important because that's an audience we're writing for. But the whole point of these two exercises is that in discovery and in getting to know a job seeker, we have been given permission to toss off our old way of writing about people, or to write in a way that highlights strengths and endearing traits. So I just want to take some time again to return to narrative medicine and just talk a little bit about something called the parallel chart. We'll look at this near the end of the presentation. But one of the trainings for narrative medicine is having physicians and nurses who are in medical school actually do this too. They write about patients, in quotations, and about how they've gotten to know them, about the person's life story, about what they did for a living, where they live, what their neighborhood looks like. Why do they do that? Why is that something that medicine is focusing on? It's because we know that this improves outcomes. And since we've imitated in our documentation the kind of the bad parts of the medical record, why not imitate this? So these medical students will meet with an advisor and they'll have a chance to do what they call the parallel chart. The parallel chart is the person can write a poem about their patient. They can write a quick essay. They can even fictionalize. The point is they're trying to write about the person creatively. And in doing so, they're getting to know that person so that we won't have, as we train people, only learning about how to make sure your initials are properly attached to a progress note, but how to write in a way that knows the job seeker in a better way. So writing that is deficit-based, these kinds of things that we have to do, is important to know that it's at odds with what we are trying to accomplish. It's at odds with portraying a job seeker positively, of helping people be included in their communities. Since we can't stop that kind of writing and it's necessary, then we need to know, right, where it comes from. Functional limitations, right? Those things of daily activities that people cannot do often help them get funding. Gaps in achieving those things help us say we're going to provide a certain services support to help. It's rooted in that, right? In behavior, traits, learning, coping, working, functioning, all that kind of stuff is the way that we write in a necessary approach for funding and services. But because we do that, we have to be aware of how that impacts us as we do the work that we're really challenged to do, both under the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act and the settings rule around CMS. To be person-centered and strength-based means we're going to have to be able to figure out a way to know the job seeker narratively than the way we have in the past. This is another great, I think, task, a little assignment that I know I do, sometimes formally every year, and then other times just helping other folks do it. But to think about, just kind of casually, where am I spending most of my writing time during a typical week? I was recently in a state where someone showed me their month audit, and it was pretty sobering. Around 75% of their writing time was focused on progress notes, deficit-based stuff. And that same person is responsible for a caseload, if you will, of people who need jobs and need more inclusive lives in their community. That has an impact on us, right? So what's the purpose of this writing if you're doing your own writing audit? You might want to jot these things down. You might want to create a little report for yourself, or again, just do it casually, informally. What's the purpose? In other words, why am I doing this writing? Many of us will say, because my boss tells me to, and the state tells that person to. Well, that's okay. There might be some other reasons, though. Figuring that out is important. What are the rules that will apply in this writing? We saw some of the rules earlier from a state that were formal, but there's some informal ones too. The same VR counselor I was mentioning was sharing a story that her boss said, you can't put in good things in the notes, because then we're not going to be able to say we're providing supports for this person. It's much like trying to qualify for SSDI if you've been working. You've got to show that there's stuff wrong with you to get it, right? So there are these informal rules, right, all the time in our writing. And are they useful in the writing that I'm doing? In other words, if I carry that over into the writing I'm doing around a job seeker, probably isn't that useful. We say in creative writing that all of us have an editor on our shoulder. What's that editor's name? If you're writing about your family, it probably has those family members' names. If you're writing to a VR counselor, or if you're in a role of support coordination or an employment specialist or job developer, there's an editor on our shoulder. All of us have that. Naming it, figuring that out is important. What outcome, both, kind of intermediately and then long term, does this writing support? So for instance, if someone has been spending most of their time in a group home and then a day program and the van back to the group home, and we are wanting and the person is desiring more of a community presence, both through work and inclusion, how does that writing help me serve that outcome? Taking this audit, I think, can also be a fun staff activity, something that can make us aware of writing, make us aware of narration in our work. If we simply do that, it will improve what we're doing, because if we don't have an awareness, say, of that the medical chart's been influencing us for 100 years, or that we sometimes carry over that kind of language into our more person-centered writing, if we know that, we can do a better job. Writing audit is a great way to do that, so I hope you use it. So that number one question, what is the purpose of the writing? So many times people have to qualify for services, maintain funding, treatment, interventions, whatever we call that in our systems. That again can come from state dollars, it can come from waiver supports, vocational rehabilitation, other funding systems. And they're used to create ISPs, IEPs, or other formal human service plans. And in that way, that kind of writing serves its purpose. But after that determination is made, right? What type of writing is necessary for me to arrive at an outcome? For the person to be working, to have a customized job, to be more included. And am I switching? This is the big piece. This is the one that I see folks struggle with all the time. Even when we're given permission, say in discovery or writing a career profile, doing the discovery staging record, am I switching from that deficit-based to person-centered narratives? Do I know this person's story? Or am I dragging that stuff that's negative, that's deficit-based, over to what I'm supposed to be doing, particularly for those folks who have reputations? If I only know a person by their reputation, if I only know them in one setting or only through one other person, I don't know that person very well. We can all think about people who may not like us that much, who probably wouldn't be able to give someone else a good understanding of who we are. Awareness about this, I think, is important as we move into doing discovery and trying to help someone find a place in the community for work. So, deficit system impacts our person-centeredness. It impacts us focusing on strengths. From moving to fixing problems to contributions. That's why so many folks have trouble writing about endearing traits. Once they start practicing it, they don't. But they have to be given permission, right? You have to practice this because we are immersed in the other kind of writing. That way that really qualifies us for services rather than propels and supports people in employment in the community. But again, as I've said, we're not the only field doing this. I've talked about narrative medicine. It's also sometimes called patient-centered healthcare, knowing the person's life. In mental health, we call that recovery-oriented mental health treatment. Narrative medicine, as I've mentioned, Dr. Rita Charon. There's also in mental health, embracing this whole idea of the narrative. Person-centeredness around post-secondary and transition for students. So we're not the only ones doing this, but we don't want to continue to imitate our clinical background and the influences from how the Medicaid piece in our system has impacted us. So my favorite part, folks, is writing so that we know the job seeker and creating a discovery narrative. Knowing is in quotes because you have to be curious. You have to know someone to connect them to other people who are like-minded, who have similar endearing traits, right? That knowing is half the battle. That if we can do that in a different way, document that in a different way, then obviously the outcomes that we're seeking will be ever present. However, just like anything else in our field, and probably just in human nature, we call something by a name and then it ends up not being that thing. So if you are doing any type of discovery, if you're doing any type of person-centered career planning, creating any type of vocational career profile, if you're doing that in your office by yourself, you're not doing it. It requires action, right? People, all of us need to be in different environments to produce different information. And that provides opportunities to explore preferences. If we're not, that's why it makes it so difficult for people to write about someone's endearing traits, because they just have not spent time with that person in different environments. Other people know people differently than we do. That's one of the big keys. Often when I'm helping people try to figure out how to, again, facilitate discovery, create person-centered career plans, they'll say, I don't think they know anybody else. And isn't that the truth a lot of times? Most folks in our systems don't have a lot of unpaid support. And recently, someone in a state got pretty excited because they tracked down a special education teacher who knew the job seeker really well. They did that by getting the name, Googling, finding the school website, finding the teacher and the teacher's email, and pulling that person back into the job seeker's life. And I should say the employment specialist was just blown away by how much information they got from that person. But being person-centered in discovery and planning, it does require, I think, an understanding of our roles. Just like we don't spend much time being aware of how we write and why we write, what influences us, we don't spend much time thinking about the power of roles. And so I want to do that just for a little while, because we don't want the writing to be done really in the same environment that we've done other types of writing. If you have a loved one or someone that you care about deeply, you know that buildings and offices in human services are not neutral places. They're just not. They signify a professional fortress. They can be intimidating, and most of us, when we're in those situations, don't give great information. A desk and which side that you sit on immediately creates a dominant role, right? We believe in those situations because of being in school or in other places that there are right answers to give, right? Holding a form and making notes and flipping pages, that reminds us of places where we're not in control. Again, maybe elementary, high school, doctor's offices. Asking these kinds of yes or no questions as a way to get to know a job seeker, it doesn't work. It seems procedural, it seems legal, and once you ask a yes or no question, there isn't much more to get. And it also reinforces our belief that there's a power role. So how do you fix those things? Again, this kind of writing needs to be done outside of an office. It requires action. So spending time with the job seeker in their home, obviously, that's key. Visiting the neighborhood, going where they go. I've been to lots of faith-based activities with folks. It's really important to them. I would not know that person or the people who know them if I didn't do that. Chores at home, family routines, daily schedules. That's a way to remedy how we then write about someone. It gives us something to write about. If I'm only asking the day manager at a group home how they know a specific job seeker, I'm not going to get as good information as knowing somebody in other settings. We're striving, right, to whether the person can communicate in traditional ways or needs augmented or assisted communication. We're trying to sustain an ongoing conversation. You can do that with people who don't talk, by the way. Repeated contact with someone and the people who know that person creates trust. And that's an important thing to do. It impacts the information that we get. Talking to others about the job seeker, friends and siblings and neighbors and educational personnel, all kinds of people, right? I guess it goes without saying that we need permission from the job seeker about who is involved. There's some of my siblings who I wouldn't want to give information. But anyway, the information can help us, particularly with those folks who don't communicate in traditional ways. I love seeing kind of artifacts when I visit someone's home, not only asking about the family, but really looking at videos and photo albums, and just recently found out so much about a job seeker from his mom, who had created this wonderful photo album that just really created a narrative. I never would have seen it if I would have been doing this work in the office. But those things, right, are in people's living spaces. They're not there. They're not in our office. So you gotta take action and get outside of the office and the desk. This comes a little from our friends at Dartmouth University, particularly Deborah Becker. It's from a book about the individual placement and supports model for folks with severe and persistent mental illness. But it kind of reiterates this whole idea that it's not a good idea to use a profile or or any document that's supposed to be serving person-centeredness and career planning as a questionnaire. Again, we're not just filling this out, we're getting to know the person and then coming to the writing. That is a conversation that will flow in a natural way, connecting with people. Food often helps, as we know, but we're reminded here from this text that one of the goals of working on the profile is to develop a relationship. How do you develop a relationship? By knowing one another. And that if we view this kind of writing as simply getting a form filled and completed and in someone's file, that really detracts from the entire process. And I can't tell you how many people who are great, either job developers or good at customizing jobs, who are kind of poor at this process. And it's important that this process is supported in the beginning because, big surprise, we have turnover in our systems. The idea of turnover and writing narratively about somebody is intricately connected because I want to leave a trail, if we have this turnover, of positivity, of endearing traits, of possibilities and opportunities, not just labels and clinical documentation. So that leads us to, I think, a very natural progression of knowing someone and then helping determine ideal conditions of employment, right? That these ideal conditions of employment are connected to how much time I spend with the person. Writing about those conditions actually helps us know the person better. I have here a Dr. Charon reading. By the way, if you're interested in that, if you just Google Dr. Charon and narrative medicine, you'll see that. I won't read that now, but it really does connect to writing helps us know the person. I'll say this to people all the time if they're stuck in creating a vocational profile, a career profile. I'll say, get out of the document. Just write about endearing traits, about ideal conditions of employment. Just write the person's vocational themes. Do it as though you're writing in a journal. And when you do that, it frees you from what I call the task mastery of forms. Forms master us in this field, and we have to be able to break free from that in the narrative. So one way to do that, again, without getting inside of whatever form you were required to turn in your particular role or funding system, provider agency, state, is to ask yourself some of these kind of broader narrative questions, again, outside the form. What must be present or not for this job seeker to be successful? Shrug off what you've read in behavior plans and ISPs and individualized work plans. Shrug that off. Don't write with our human service speak. What must be present or not? Write it out. What should the work culture be? Boy, do we miss this all the time. We're working with someone who has some pretty significant impacts of brain injury, who also happens to be, if you spend time, a great one-line deliverer. Great sense of humor, wry, funny, but most people don't get that because they don't spend time enough listening. In a work culture, that person must have somebody, supervisor, coworker, maybe both, who also has that trait, right? That's what work culture is about. It's about connecting. It's the old adage about, you'll leave a job if you don't like the people, but you like the task, and vice versa. People are important. The culture is important. Write that out for this specific person. You can use the person that we did in the other two exercises earlier in the presentation. What are the top 3 most important elements that need to be present for success? In other words, I'm kind of building on the first and second bullet. If I had to rank them, write that out. Why? Think about that. Consider natural supports and write that out. Not after we place somebody and try to figure out who might take on some extra duties, but write that out right now, outside of a form. These bullets, these ways of knowing somebody help us determine ideal conditions of employment. In other words, you really are doing like what we're doing in narrative medicine. You're creating a parallel chart. You're writing outside of the mandated documentation and finding a way to know the person. One way to do this is to kind of meditatively think about the person celebrating 1 year of success on the job. To imagine that. And then write out who would need to be the strongest supporter. Thinking past the immediate, group home, mom, dad, VR counselor, make it specific to the person and write that out. If you do these 3-5 bullets, I think one of the things that you'll find, and certainly when I do this, is I either have a lot to write or very little. And it's a gauge in knowing how well I know the person. And I think if you kind of play around with this a little, you'll see that it will be a way to tell the other work you may need to do in other settings and knowing the person through other people. Well, most of us, again, because of our training in human services, the systems that we're embedded in, we do have trouble turning what we experience into narrative, right? What we observed and listened to, and figuring out, right, how to make that a narrative document. I think a way to do that are some of the exercises I've given you. And then when you get back into whatever document you are using as a way to provide proof of person-centered career planning, that you think of sentences and paragraphs, not one-word answers, not bullets. The act of writing in and of itself helps us understand another human being. So we're going to use description. We're going to use anecdotes of the time with the person or a story somebody else may have told us of that job seeker. We're going to use those narrative threads to make something that's actually more dimensional than just a medical chart entry or a Medicaid waiver chart entry. That it's a living, breathing document, that it captures those ideal conditions of employment through endearing traits, through knowing the person in various ways. If you feel like at some point you're just filling out a form, the number one reason that feels that way is because you haven't spent time with the person. I think all of us want our life experiences, our preferences honored. Pretty interesting. In the hotel this morning, I got a text message from someone I worked with 10 years ago who unfortunately now has been admitted to a long-term care facility, and we're trying to help with that. But I think because that's difficult for him and difficult for anybody, he texted me and said, hey, do you want to see my prom picture? Right? And that's pretty touching to me. Why? Because that means he's not just a patient in a long-term care facility on a Medicaid waiver removed from his community. He's somebody like all of us who has life experiences, preferences. To honor that and to use those insights to generate a real profile that captures a life is important, not just filling in a document. Well, just some quick reference guides for effective writing. Write notes immediately after contact. Don't edit those. Read those notes aloud shortly after the contact. I love doing that. State information, but also use description. You can edit, friends, and edit out acronyms to make it sound better, but it also helps it stay alive, if you know what I'm talking about. Consider a parallel chart. Again, we'll return to this at the end here. Share this stuff with the focus person, with the VR counselor, with the support coordinator, of course, with permission. Just real quickly, I think in light of how we look at observation and judgments, it's important to know what's an observation and what's a judgment. Sarah is competent in washing clothes, observation or judgment. Fred does not want to work, observation or judgment. Fred was at home when I arrived to pick him up for the scheduled meeting with the owner of AutoZone, obviously that's an observation. The other two are judgments. Reading out loud will help you be able to hear that as well. If you haven't already known about the National Center on Disability and Journalism, it's really cool. I believe it's at Arizona State. I think I have the link here. But using that people first language is important because, as we'll see later, if we don't, we act on stereotypes. Making sure that you use this. I use the National Center on Disability and Journalism when I come upon a story every day, by the way, that's written kind of poorly and not used person first language. I kind of send the reporter the link to the National Center on Disability and Journalism because that's better than me talking to them as an advocate. So obviously when you're creating a discovery profile, you might again call that a vocational profile, a career profile. It's important that the job seeker sees that, right, and gets to review it. That sensitive portions, things that all of us would not probably want about ourselves, only get shared per the person's approval. The bulk, though, the bulk of this discovery profile should reflect those ideal conditions of employment, the strengths, the interests, the supports needed, and preferences. There's already, right? There's already plenty of negative information about somebody. We have been given the permission to create here in this document something that's very different than how we usually document services and supports. So just a little on descriptive language. You are capturing a portion of someone's life, so it can't read like the one you just did last week, right? It has to sound different, read differently. I can't tell you how many that I help people review that just could be a very generic discovery profile. It's important to know that language and words direct our actions. So does this help me get someone towards employment, or does it put up more barriers? Do I know the person better after doing the discovery profile? Can I link that information to specific job development activities? Does it read well? It can't have human service speak in it. If it lacks those concrete details of settings and experiences and real life nuances, then all we're doing is creating something and giving it a different name. One way to think about this is, how would you like to be profiled? How would you like to be perceived in a written document? If you were the person, would there be parts of yourself you wouldn't want included? I know there are plenty of things I would not want included about myself or my loved ones. We get jobs on our strengths, right? On our endearing traits, not the things that we're not good at. We want to emphasize the positive opportunities, endearing traits. This is a chance to do the opposite of what typically is in our documentation. Discovery is a document, yes. It ends up as a document, whatever name you give it, but it's a process, it's a map that will create an employment outcome. I don't know why we'd do it otherwise. So one thing that I mentioned at the beginning is that we wanted to really focus on the influence of the medical model in our systems, but also stereotypes. And at this point, we are turning it up a little and tuning it up, I should say, and editing and rewriting. This is where stereotypes that we're not even aware of creep in. So you have to think about the audience for this kind of writing. Is it in their vernacular? Are the desired outcomes related to the writing? Yes, there is a quote here from Bob Seger, what to leave in and what to leave out. Overwriting is good because it gives us an opportunity then to shape that narrative for the most essential parts. Reading it out loud for clarity is really important. If you do this well, if you've spent time with the person and created a narrative, then that narrative can be taken into either traditional or visual resumes and portfolios. In other words, we know the person well enough that we can write about them well enough and create documents that propel us towards that outcome. Just real briefly, I won't spend much time on this, but this is the kind of 4 different audiences of writing. It gets links back to me. I hope you hear this, and I'm not saying we don't have to do the kind of writing that's deficit-based. We do. But know that there's an audience for assessments for eligibility, for ongoing disability reviews, right? There's what we're talking about today, the audience for a person-centered plan for employment. There's an audience for behavioral support plans. But knowing, right, which audience we're writing for is important. Those 3 that are around eligibility, disability reviews, and behavior support plans obviously have an audience, but we can't drag them in to the person-centered plan. So I do this all the time, both in creative writing and doing the writing in customized employment and discovery profiles. I read out loud. If you don't do this, I think most people enjoy it. So give it a shot. Make sure the room is quiet and confidential. Recording this helps us play it back. Listen for parts that are clunky, that are repetitive, that aren't smooth. You can't do that in your head. Perhaps you can. It just doesn't work as well. Out loud really highlights that. Don't stop. Resist the temptation to stop and edit. You can do that later. Again, if you record it, listen back to it, take notes, repeat it. You can see by now that I take documentation in a serious way because it really is about creating a narrative of someone's life. The time I've spent with that person, the people I've talked to is really important. How often does the person's first name appear? This is a way to kind of do, earlier we talked about the writing audit. This is a kind of a way to look now at your narrative. You might consider this the 3rd edit. If the person's first name's not in there, probably not very person-centered. Choose a random paragraph, right? Is it 90% focused on strengths? I know somebody viewing will say, well, he just wants to sugarcoat their problems. That's not the issue. But we really do want this document to be 90% strengths. For my goodness, we're trying to help the person be employed. What parts of the text can I use in job development? Think about those endearing traits. Do I have at least some quoted comments? It's a person's life, right? I probably want some quotes from other people that know them well. Does it reflect multiple environments? Does my writing only show me knowing the person in a day program, group home, maybe the library? How much of what I've written is taken from other sources? We believe that in getting to know a job seeker, we're having unique real-time experiences. If I'm taking a lot of documentation from other types of files or charts, that's probably an indication that I'm not spending enough time knowing the person. Again, that is rooted in how much of the writing is based on new experiences. Does the writing create stereotypes or lessen them? And this fine-tuning and that kind of editing really helps us think about stereotypes that we haven't really thought about in our writing. So I'll preface it with this. The section that we're moving into is really one of those things, just like being aware of how long the medical chart has existed, how other human service systems use narrative and writing and documentation in various ways. This is just an awareness. It's something that we've trained people on and many times bring in different types of literature and text to do this. But I'm always amazed as a writer, again, as a sibling and somebody who works in our field, how often people get portrayed in stereotypical ways. All kinds of resources for that now. There's a greater awareness of it. But oddly enough, ironically enough, there's not enough awareness in our own system. So being aware of what we call these templates of deficit, right, that are kind of readily used to describe people. That's important because it ends up impacting us in ways that we don't know. I think once you think a little bit about this and become aware of it, you'll notice that not only in discussions with other people who are talking about labels rather than a person, but you'll see it in different kinds of media, movies, newspaper, television. Most of us were required, probably in high school or in college, to read of Mice and Men, or at least you took the Cliff Notes, which I think now are called Spark Notes or something. But it's a great novel, right? Steinbeck does a great job of portraying an individual, two individuals. But because it was so widely known and regarded, we have carried some of the things that are characterized in the story throughout other narratives. And I think you'll see that when we go through it. So, Mice and Men has been produced quite a bit, right? Off-Broadway, Broadway, local theaters. And it moves from kind of an individualized portrayal of a specific person into someone acting out what they think Lenny is, right? That we don't use the term at that time, but we know he has an intellectual disability. And as we act on this template of deficit, it gets exaggerated, right? So from the original text, and you can make a parallel here to our own writing. Think about somebody who has a reputation and you've read and gotten to know the person through maybe progress notes. And when you meet them, suddenly they're not as intimidating or don't seem as tied to their reputation as what the notes say. What we're doing is acting on a template of deficit. We're exaggerating unknowingly those deficits. As you can see, it has a ripple effect. More exaggeration and less individualization creates labels of people and not Lenny as a person. It gets more and more absurd here, right? And that begins to make us have stereotypical beliefs about someone's label rather than who they are. You can see this in Looney Tunes. If you're as old as I am, you know that the little abominable snow rabbit says, "I will name him George and I will hug him and pet him and squeeze him." That's directly from of Mice and Men. And it's a cartoon caricature. So many people then come to know this kind of character as something that doesn't know its own strength, it's going to hurt you. My goodness, we've already turned it into some type of hybrid animal. You see what I'm saying? So the template of deficit gets more and more exaggerated. Mickey Rooney, who portrayed somebody with an intellectual disability in a movie called Bill, said that one of his primary inspirations was Lenny. So he's acting on these templates of deficit. And I think if this was a movie being marketed and watched today, that we probably wouldn't make the character have that expression as we see here. We probably wouldn't put his name with one L kind of, leaning over, it's not quite right. So that template of deficit, these stereotypes kind of invade our thinking, both within our human service systems and then in media in general. So this is a quick Google search. I love to see how people are teaching of Mice and Men, mostly because it connects my interest in creative writing and our work. But this person has written, who's a business major, his impression of Lenny. And what he's saying here, being a business major, is this is how he portrays somebody. The real question is, when that person is owning a business, hiring people, is he able to let go of that template of deficit? Or will he carry that from that ripple effect into his work, into talking, for instance, to a job developer? So what's the point? Well, if you start paying attention to this, you will see that these stereotypes are reinforced every day. You can watch The Green Mile, maybe you've read it. There are a lot of similarities to Lenny and John Coffey, being large, unintelligent, innocent, right? Both of them, in fact, have mice that fall into their care. But there's something that I always notice. I'll hear people say when I'm out working with providers and families or VR counselors, well, he's kind of a Rain Man, right? Well, they're taking another template that was created. Or sometimes people say he's a Lenny, doesn't know his own strength, or other characters from books and television and movies that kind of really cement these ideas of stereotypes. I bet you've heard people say, well, the person has Down syndrome, they're very, very loving. Or people, they don't know their own strength. These are things that we're not even aware of, right? So how do you avoid it? How do you avoid it in first our work and then being a good steward when you see it in popular media? Well, being aware of it. There are plenty of these stereotypes. Folks with physical disabilities being heroes, they're heroically courageous because they're able to get up every day. Death is dignity. There's a movie that I'm blanking on right now, just last year, is made from a book around a romance where death is dignity. Certainly you see that in other movies as well. Mental illnesses, obviously, how many movies are somebody having a mental illness and becoming violent? That people are sexually deviant because of certain disabilities, that people are eternal childs, right? They're eternal children, that somehow they have a mind age of blank and X, that people have extraordinary sensory abilities simply because they may be deaf or blind. Perpetually affectionate, again, intellectual disability, that somehow somebody's a soothsayer. That's often coupled with Native Americans. Admirable for just overcoming everyday activities. We see that all the time, that portrayal. That diminishes somebody. It puts people in a template of deficit. Pitiful lives, that the parents sinned. This is always amazing to me, that there's still beliefs that somehow someone is born because there has been sin. Wholly innocent, again, affectionate, Down syndrome, two different personalities, bipolar. You'll see this if you start paying attention to it. And it's important because it impacts the way that we write about somebody, how we help portray that person to a potential employer. Well, I mentioned again that we were going to return to the parallel chart, and I'll show you how we're using this in a couple of pilots. It's basically an opportunity for any, we show physician here, but any clinician, any kind of support professional, to see somebody through that person's eyes. It's an opportunity to reflect on our emotions about a particular experience. We often work with people who are highly isolated, and if that doesn't touch your heart, I'm not sure it's the work for you. So we have emotions around this work. Using this chart is really the way that people reflect on the work that we're doing. Just a medical student here who is talking about the experience, that it was difficult at first. It's a quote from 2015, to write a narrative about a patient without delving into the medical aspect. Same thing for us. It's the exact same thing as saying it's hard for me to write about endearing traits because I'm still embedded in rehabilitation or waiver or support coordination. But he goes on to say it's a great way to not only get stuff off your chest, but it's a way to also have the opportunity in a judge-free environment to kind of look at the way their care, the interventions, the supports, if you will, are being delivered to this specific person. That this person loves that medicine is moving in this humanistic way, this way of knowing someone's specific narrative. The way that we know somebody is by spending time, by writing about those experiences, and not using the old way of doing documentation. So we're using the parallel chart with some employment specialists and VR counselors. These are 6 weeks. They're facilitated. They're confidential. No one's actual names are used. People are encouraged to read from their work. Many times this brings about connections to why we're in the field, journaling, poetry, that kind of thing. The group then gives feedback. If you've ever participated in any type of creative process, it's very similar to that. But we look at, how is the professional process impacting what we're trying to do for a job seeker, engaging that job seeker, knowing that job seeker. And we're going to look at this at 3 and 6 and 9 months. What we found out in narrative medicine, if you read about that, is that there are positive clinical outcomes associated with practicing this type of narration. And then we'll collect data from the employment specialist and the VR counselor just to look at just some really basic kinds of feedback, mostly anecdotal about this process. So I want to give you some sources here. I mentioned the National Center on Disability and Journalism at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism, Arizona State. That's just ncdj.org. A great resource that you can send to any journalist who you think maybe has done a good job in portraying someone in the media, or maybe could use just a little more awareness around those stereotypes we talked about. On the flip side, there's one that's specifically related to mental health and media at Mass General Hospital. Really interesting that their total mission is focused on the portrayal of mental health, mental illness, and the stigmas. SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, is also, by the way, spending some time and resources on the stereotypes of mental health and substance abuse and how that impacts people having full lives, returning to work, all that kind of thing. So that's massgeneral.org, and those are 2 great sources if you're interested. I'm a frequent contributor to a magazine called The Sun. I wrote an essay there that was published October or November of 2016, actually called Activities of Daily Living, with my experience of helping somebody at Central State Hospital before it closed in Indianapolis, and some of my shortcomings there. But The Sun is a great magazine around kind of the work that we do, really, human services, advocacy, social justice, recovery, inclusion, all of that. It's not specifically disability related, but certainly the core mission and values. So you couldn't go wrong by checking out that. And then just finally, our friends at Dartmouth have a great resources on the vocational career profile that's used in IPS. Certainly Griffin-Hammis.com has a great deal of information on what we call our discovery staging record and that process. You've probably heard me say by now several times, narrative medicine. You can find that at narrativemedicine.org. The Pacer Center, some of you are probably familiar with, around transition. And finally, just again, ncdj.org and the Sun magazine. And as always, I would love to hear from you. And there is my email at the University of Georgia at our UCED IHDD. Well, I hope this has been helpful. I hope that you've had some time to reflect on the kind of work that we do and how important it is to move from one way of documenting and narrating supports and services to one that's focused on endearing traits, possibilities, opportunities, inclusion. And I hope that's been helpful. Thank you so much.